right, hello everybody, and welcome to the final installment in the Gamification of War series. My name is Matthew Gibson. I'm a Carolina Public Humanities Fellow and a PhD candidate in the History Department at UNC Chapel Hill. I want to start by thanking, though, the Carolina Public Humanities and Humanities for the Public Good Centers for both sponsoring this event. I also want to thank John Regan, Bret Devereaux, Keith Stine, and Josh Beck for taking the time to be a part of this event. Last but not least, I also want to thank you all, the audience, for your interesting questions and also just for being here with us today. Before I introduce my speakers, though, I just want to briefly explain why this event is called Gamifying War as opposed to another title. In the brainstorming phases of this event, I did as most people do nowadays, and I just wanted to quickly kind of Google and understand the definition of what gamifying means. But in combination of taking that definition, but also with interacting with the speakers here today, the working definition that I have for this term is that gamification is when developers or creators apply typical game mechanics. So think of things like point scoring, competition with others, and rules of play. And when they apply these mechanics to basically aspects of war for this sake. But with that being said, let me go ahead and introduce my speakers for today. First, I want to start with John Regan, who is a history instructor at Sand Hills Community College and Richmond Community College. He teaches courses related to US and military history. Also, another thing about John is that he is a US Army veteran who served in both Desert Storm, Desert Shield, and also served in peacekeeping missions in the former Yugoslavia. Next, I have Josh Beck, who is a business owner, also a US Army veteran, and a contributor, one of the two contributors that I have today with Little Wars TV, and I'll briefly kind of explain what they do. The third person that I have today is Keith Stine, who is a history instructor at York College of Pennsylvania, and also, like I said, the other contributing member to Little Wars TV. And if anyone is interested in Little Wars TV, they are basically a historical wargaming club that sort of educates fellow gamers, but also the public about the hobby of wargaming. They have content on YouTube, Spotify, and you can sort of find them on Patreon as well. And then last but not least, we have with us today Bret Devereaux, history instructor at UNC Chapel Hill, where he also received his PhD. Bret also has his own blog, which is called A Collection of Unmitigated Pedantry, a look at history and popular culture. But with that being said, welcome guys, and I'm really glad to have you all. And also just thank you for being a part of this panel.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Yep, glad to be here.
Absolutely. So the first topic that I wanted to kind of get into is this idea of video games and consumerism. And just to kind of provide some context here, game developers are multifaceted. They make a product that immerses people into a world and holds their attention while obviously trying to make money. In this complicated relationship between producer and consumer, what is missing from war video games? Specifically, I want to kind of come to both John and Josh first, you all being veterans, and to add a little bit more of what it means for war games to miss certain content. It's very hard to find or have information when you're on the battlefield. And so I was wondering if both John and Josh, can you offer sort of your perspectives, being veterans, what's sort of missing from war games, and how does the amount of information that war video games provide people, how does that sort of complicate various perceptions about war, combat, and things of those nature? John, do you mind starting first?
Yeah. It's a good question because whether it's tabletop or video, there's three levels of warfare: strategic, operational, and tactical. And typically they focus on one or the other. It's hard to meld all three together because each level is distinctly different. Likewise, there's different levels of intensity or, of conflict. from low intensity, which would be a low conflict, like a peacekeeping mission that has strategic ramifications. Then you have your high intensity, which is straight up force on force. And then you have this unconventional aspect of it. And so does every conflict stay in one phase? No, they morph between the two. And that's where it gets complicated, because a lot of people want to focus on one aspect or the other. So that's where I think video games or desktops kind of fall a little short.
Yeah, I agree with John in that regard. And I think tabletop games kind of fall into that same category. When we put on war games at our club or on the channel, we usually engage either we put on a game that is at a higher level, more divisional or core level game, or we go all the way down to the small tactical level, which would be squad based, platoon based games. It is kind of hard to do all of that together at one time. And I think games lack that. I think generally also video games, for the most part, and I'm not sure, I think part of it's design, but part of it's also player initiated, is the lack of teamwork. I don't see a lot of like games that really work well to implement or encourage teamwork. It seems to me like a lot of games are more individually driven, and rewards are decided on a personal basis. How many kills did you get?
Yeah, I think video games give you too much autonomy. There's no command structure that you're part of. There's no punishment for going outside of a command structure. There is none imposed on you. You don't have to follow orders given to you directly by somebody that you're actually face to face with. You have these vague orders and you have mission objectives, but there's a lot of autonomy, and that's a big thing missing. I think in video games especially.
Bret, did you want to add anything to that, or?
Yeah, two things. One, I absolutely agree that most games, do give the player a lot of autonomy, and there isn't a command structure. I think I would caveat that with the small exception that in the competitive multiplayer space, that stops being true.
Right.
And my mind immediately shot to it's a fairly niche game, but to high level play in something like EVE Online, there is absolutely a command structure. But relatively few gamers are going to engage with those kinds of games. They're by their nature selective and niche. The other thing I was going to say about things that games miss, one thing that I think is true almost universally of video games, and mostly true of tabletop games, although sometimes less true, is that they're essentially numerical exercises. They're fundamentally binary. Things are either true or not true about the game state in very absolute terms. And of course, right, this is a mathematical view of war that, right, Clausewitz famously knocks down at the very beginning of On War, that war is in fact a space of gray zones, of uncertainties, of imponderables, and questions that cannot be mathematically resolved. And so everything that fits into that space, experience, morale, cohesion, and the emotional content of war, things that it's not that games can't try and simulate them, they absolutely do, but they struggle to, because these are fundamentally not mathematical questions. And the game as a structure is fundamentally mathematical in nature.
Yeah, morale and fear is a hard and almost impossible thing to impart in a video game. And I noticed something that video games, and maybe this is not a lack of, but something that becomes a big focus of many of the ones I've either played or been involved in. They become very focused on military science, like the technology and the weapons and that stuff, without necessarily getting into the human experience of war. But I don't know how that, how do you really do that? That becomes difficult.
And to kind of tie back sort of to the follow-up question, who actually an audience member asked this question about the relationship between on-the-ground information, circling back to both Josh and John, in your experience, as veterans, either in combat situations or just in training situations, video games very much provide a lot of information for the player. It creates a lot of awareness. It's literally information that provides them key objectives and all those things. But, in you all's experience, exactly how difficult is it to acquire this sort of on the ground information? And how do you all sort of adjust to either not having enough sufficient information or maybe having an abundance of information? What are you all sort of, what are your thoughts about that?
The battlefield, because I've been in, Iraq, this latest thing a few times in my life. It's become a lot more technical than it was, say, back when I started in the late 80s. You get so much information thrown at you. And, from as an enlisted soldier and leader to becoming an officer and leader, commander, you're inundated with so much information. So some of it, if you're in those situations, whether it's face to face or more in a command level, timing is everything. You can only process so much at one time. So how do you deal with it? It goes back to training, simulation, doing a, this is what you do. It's a conditioned response. But sometimes some of that stuff comes in because not all the information is being fed to you. Some of it you're picking up around you, what you're seeing. Because even though we have drones and all this other stuff that can give you feeds and you can shoot messages and all this other stuff, you don't have time to look at that, so you have to process it and have situational awareness of what's going on. You have to, you can have your big objective, but you got to know your commander's intent and your end state, task, purpose, end state. You break it down to those three things, and those are sentences. Those are not paragraphs, which helps you as a leader and even as an individual. If you're just a member of the team, if you know your task, purpose, and end state, when all else fails, some of that you have to decipher on your own.
Yeah, when I was in combat, I never had a blinking arrow that told me the direction I needed to go in to achieve my objective. I never had a heads up map that had blinking enemies around, but what I did have is I had my ears and I had my mission, my objective that I was given in the morning in my briefing. So although it's not as technical, you still were using that a lot to decide, okay, which direction to head, where are the enemy, I'm using my ears. I can hear gunfire over here over my left side. So I haven't, I can hear general things going on, orders being shouted in another language. So those kind of things you might not be able to have in the game as easy. So they give you a heads up map, blinking, heads up display kind of map instead. And just kind of, it's just two different types of information you're being provided. And like John said, you can't, just like in games, sometimes you ignore one part of the information because you're too focused on what's directly, immediately most pressing.
Absolutely. And I want to kind of shift gears here to sort of the experience of gamers. And this is kind of dabbling in the realm of gamer assumption. But, in my conversations with all of you, we talked a lot about, the emotional content of real war. And I'd like to kind of just dig into that again here. also, this has also been a very driving public conversation about video games, or the correlation between video games and violence in young people. So hopefully maybe we can kind of either touch on that, or maybe touch on how video games might communicate that aspect poorly, or if maybe you've come across video games that do that well. But the first question I have for you all, John, Josh, and Keith, you all have kids, and also you're in roles of educator. Bret, you're very much in an educational role as well. But the first question I have for you all about the experience of gamers is, do you all think gamers are aware of this dissonance between sort of actual warfare and their games?
Well, I'm pretty sure the non-veteran gamers are. They're not aware. I mean, they are. There is a dissonance.
Okay.
You know what I mean? I just think it's hard because it's hard to simulate. It really, I mean, much like the morale we talked about with the earlier questions, and the fear and the chaos and the anxiety and the multiple things going through your head and the noises you're hearing, all that stuff is kind of hard. So there's a disconnect. And I think that the video games just kind of, particularly because you can just respawn, there's no pressing desire to stay alive.
Yeah.
I can only speak for the non-gamers, or maybe I shouldn't speak for them, but I'm aware of two types that are non-veteran gamers, and there are those who are aware that they haven't had that experience, that we know what we don't know. Like we're aware that I've never experienced that, and I can't experience it. And a video game is a pale comparison. And then those who seem to be like, I've never experienced it, but aren't aware that they, don't know it. There's sort of a disconnect. So I don't know, maybe that's just different people's experiences, what they take away from video games, but.
Definitely. How about Bret or John? Do you all have any things that you would like to add to those comments, or maybe your own opinions or thoughts?
Yeah, I would just say that in my own experience, talking with gamers, looking at my comment section, I think there's a sort of a general awareness by most people playing these games that their experience playing the game does not necessarily have a lot to do with real combat. They know that on some level. What they don't know is where the disconnects are, right? There's an awareness, this isn't real, but I don't know what's wrong about it because I don't have the real to compare it against. And so there is a sort of a sense of inaccuracy, but not a knowledge of what is inaccurate, which can be tricky because then they can come away feeling like elements of the presentation are real that aren't, and vice versa. That there's an awareness that there is an artificiality, but an inability to assess the artificiality.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a history guy. I started out for my MA. I started out doing business. I took too many statistics class to say, too much math, man. But with those things, I did learn about statistics because I've kind of looked at this as we were going into this conversation. And, statistics is what you want to factor in and what you want to factor out. Because depending on which side of the fence people stand on, you can find data that will support one way or another. It just, what viewpoint do you want? And I guess that's the magic of math, or statistics in particular. Anyway, all that made my head hurt. So going back to history, yeah, I agree that you can't, they don't get it, and that's fine, because I'm not a gamer. I played a couple of games, video games in my life when it comes to these military type stuff? Have I done tabletop games, Axis and Allies, Team Yankee, stuff like that? I agree. It's a mathematical equation. You're missing so much. And how do you bridge that divide? You don't know what you don't know. And, for the greater good of society, you shouldn't have to go to that other side to see what's missing.
Mhm.
You shouldn't. That's where I just leave these video games and tabletops is where they are. They're entertainment and hobby. And that's where I see them.
Okay. And there's actually two questions here from the chat, but I'll kind of start with Thomas's question. He states, when discussing this discontent between the two, do you see any similarities when someone is controlling, for example, a combat drone in the real world, who can also be disconnected from reality as everything happening is restricted to a screen?
I'll answer that. Because this goes into one of the, gaming, even though I said it's entertainment and a hobby, is it being incorporated into modern warfare? Yes. Is it being incorporated into recruiting efforts by the military? Yes. Because you can draw them in by that. It draws intrigue. Of course, I mean, you could look at movies. Historically, those have been used to draw interest. But there's a book, it came out early 90s. It's called On Killing by Dave Grossman. And what he does is he, it's more of a psychology book, but it's focused on the American military and conflict, and not big picture, but how soldiers and service members process it. And he correlates that with the evolution of American society. And, the big takeaway from it, if I can give the Cliff Notes version, is if you distance yourself from what you're doing by space, it makes it less personal.
Mm.
Because if you take it back to, say, the World War II generation, America was a lot more rural. Okay, so we weren't hunters and gatherers, but having chickens and getting fried chicken and all this other stuff. However you're going to do it, you get it yourself. Right out the backyard. And you see that evolution over time, and how even though that's an animal, it kind of desensitizes you to this aspect of things, even though it's a living thing. And then, he correlates the difference in, from infantrymen in World War II, Vietnam, Korea, and then even bombardiers and stuff in all those conflicts, to see where we have evolved. And a lot of it has to do with technology, and that's a great thing because we don't have to have as many people out there. But that's one of the things is I think it makes it a less personal issue. And at the end of the day, warfare is a personal issue. I mean, I don't care how you scratch it. My opinion, what it matters, you can't gamify it, to get a true understanding.
Okay. Does anyone else want to also sort of add on to that question as well, or add on to that comment as well? If not, there's actually another question from Jeff Bowden in the Q&A chat, which actually links into another audience member's question. Is basically, we talk about a lot of the things that video games sort of miss from warfare and combat and things of that nature. this question from Jeff is basically, you know, do any of the panel members think that there is a way to simulate the real danger that a combatant actually experiences? Like, do you, and I guess to sort of add more to this question is, maybe what are certain aspects of war or warfare that video games emphasize less that maybe you would want to see them emphasize more? Like, are there any specific facets of warfare that you would like to see them maybe incorporate in these games going forward?
I have a thought on that. I was really involved in there was a game called Red Orchestra that was out early 2000s, and the whole emphasis of that community was realism and trying to capture a command structure and, you know, the experience of war. And in my own reading, one of the things I've noticed is the empty battlefield, the idea of the empty battlefield, that in warfare, in modern warfare, is my reading on it. You very rarely see an upright live enemy. It's just us. You don't see them. You're shooting at an area where you know somebody is, and if you do see somebody, you're catching glimpses of movement and things like that. And I've even noticed that in the coverage over the years of Afghanistan, Iraq, and even conflicts that aren't related to the United States, when you see people filming them or the GoPro or things like that, you never really see a live person that they're shooting at. It's just something that seems to be so rare. And video games, in my experience playing them, you are constantly seeing an upright live enemy that you're in combat with. You can see them. They're exposing themselves to danger in a way that isn't realistic. And I'm not, to answer the question about how would you make that realistic, it seems to be a really difficult thing. And one of the things that when I was in that community with Red Orchestra, we never really had a good answer for that. You know, one of the things tossed around was, well, we could make it you only have one life during the whole game, and once you're dead, you're dead. But
Yeah,
nobody.
That's what I was thinking, Keith, too.
Right? Yeah, but who would play that? You know, other than really diehard, dedicated. You know, I thought the idea was interesting and compelling because maybe that would have created that situation, but I'm not sure. I don't know if I don't know. Unfortunately, my answer is that I'm not sure I really have one, because of the difficulties of the desirability to play a game that restricts you in a way that would be realistic. You know, who would play it? But,
You know, I would add that it comes back to a term. Actually, I think it was John Kelly, General John Kelly from the Marines coined. You know, the strategic corporal. To incorporate that is that your individual actions, it doesn't matter if it's high intensity, low intensity, whatever, have long-term ramifications that dictate, you know, either the nature of the conflict, public perception. And so if somehow you had one of those games, and this is where if you're trying to tie all three levels of conflict, like I said, together, and you have a tactical one, you make a bonehead move, guess what? The rules just changed, you know, because, you know, there are consequences for action and inaction.
Yeah, and we try to do that too with campaign games on the tabletop. If we try to link multiple individual games together to form an overall campaign game, therefore decisions, errors, mistakes, wins and losses in the first game roll over to the second game and decide, well, how's the battlefield going to look in game 2 now that side A won the conflict.
right. And Josh, you and I have talked about this, I think in some of the other sessions we did here with Matt, about cost in wargaming, that mistakes that you make or things that you do have a cost to them. And I think we've had that discussion that tabletop wargaming seems to do a better job of replicating that than most video games. There usually aren't long-term consequences, Whereas in a lot of the wargaming we do, there are consequences, whether through it's a campaign or just the way that the scenario is for a game.
Yeah, and then these are all very much interesting points that you all are bringing up. And definitely, you know, if you have more questions, please feel free to post them in the chat. But there was one question that popped up that I thought was very interesting in relation to, I feel like, gamer experience, also some of the assumptions that various gaming communities bring from video games. And I'm gonna rephrase this question just a little bit. Reese Gilliam posted a question here. I'm gonna rephrase it a little bit to really ask the question of, you know, how much responsibility is it for the developer to ensure and make sure that you know, consumers, gamers are aware of the fact that maybe what they're depicting is either wrong, or maybe they're leaving out certain elements. So what's sort of the role or the responsibility of the developer or the company that's creating some of these games?
Is that an ethical question?
I guess we can kind of take it there. So yeah, I mean,
Is yeah, the ethics of, or you know, the ethics of gaming war.
So, in my position, I write critiques of these kinds of things. I tend to approach the question of developer responsibility from the point of view of the claims the developers are making. That some games make very few claims to depict anything realistically. They're very clear that they live in a fantasy universe, and that's fine, right? We have fantasy movies and what have you. And so I tend to find that I focus more on games that are either explicitly in their verbiage or with their marketing or visual depictions making some sort of claim to accuracy or verisimilitude, especially because in my experience, those claims tend to be accepted by players and reviewers. I reviewed a computer game, Expeditions Rome, a few weeks ago, which, you know, made sort of grand claims of historical accuracy, which I thought were ultimately mostly hollow. And one of the things that, you know, I found was that mainstream game reviewers largely accepted on face value this game as presenting a historically grounded vision of the late Roman Republic, because they had made that claim and it had been accepted without much in the way of criticism. So I tend to approach that the responsibility of the developer is directly connected to the degree to which the developer is making that claim or not. And I think a lot of developers, because it's a useful marketing tool, make the claim without the research or the care or the responsibility to back it up.
I can think of an example of where a developer made some claims and then the ethical question had a big impact on that. I forget which one it was. I'm not sure if it was Call of Duty or which one it was, but they put the player in the circumstances of having to carry out a terroristic act, and I think it was in a Russian airport, and they had to gun down civilians. And I remember that had a huge impact on the community. Like, there was all these discussions about what's the morality of that, the ethics of that. So I'm not sure, to answer the question, if it's always possible to know the ethics behind it, but I can tell you what can go wrong with that. Having remember seeing that, the outcome of that, and I'm not sure the developer thought that all the way through. But that was a really interesting example of this ethics in action.
Absolutely. And I kind of wanted to follow that up with Abby Allen's point, since we're kind of getting into ethics. I want to follow up with her question, but also mix Max Orr's question in there as well. And you know, John, I'm kind of coming to you with this question. You know, in your time in the military or in your time of service, you know, serving in leadership roles, you know, maybe the soldiers that you've had have gotten younger and younger. And so my question to you, you know, do you feel like it becomes a challenge for you when you're training soldiers to maybe remove some of those gaming assumptions from, like, privates, incoming cadets? And what I'm getting at here is maybe even this idea, and this is pointing to Mac's question, video games very much compress time. So in real combat situations, obviously, war is not 30 minutes or an hour. It can be longer than that. And so in your role as in your leadership roles, have you ever had to kind of just train those gaming assumptions out of soldiers?
I think the military, I can't speak for all branches. I can just speak for, my experience in the Army. I think by the time you get them in your unit, the initial level training has kind of gotten them through that aspect of it. Now, when I was doing initial level training, whether as a drill sergeant or training cadets at the university level, yeah, you have to break them, but quickly, when you're surrounded by professionals who, they do this for a living, they kind of catch on that, because you have to be aware of where they're coming from. Just like if you're in the classroom and you're teaching students, you got to know where they're coming from. You can not discredit what they got, but you got to be able to take that and mold it into, but no, this is how we do it. And I think, I can't speak for all militaries, but I think the United States military, the Army in particular, and the Marines for a certain point, I don't know about the other two. That's a joke. That regimen has been established, and it's you reemphasize that. Does it change over time because of things? Yeah, but that regimen of how you get them to that point to go do those things, that's where it comes down on leaders.
Yeah, I'd add it in basic training. You're pretty much stripped of any preconceived notions that you have about reality within the first 48 hours, 72 hours. And then in the next 2 to 3 weeks, you're down to the base human. You're at a base zero human, and then they build you up from there.
Yeah, and that's very interesting, definitely, to hear you all's experience, but also firsthand accounts of adding in that training component. Because, when I'm hearing you all say, obviously training, discipline, regimen is very important to, what soldiers do, and important even in order to, succeed or execute efficient combat or things of that nature. And that's something that video games either compresses to maybe button tutorials or something like that. Whereas there's a culture there in terms of military training that video games don't really tap into. But I wanted to kind of, we talked a little bit about distance and how video games kind of perpetuate this distance of maybe this isn't real, or this is a part of a fantasy world, or things of that nature. But I wanted to also talk about distance as a way in terms of thinking about civilians. Over the last 20 plus years, we've seen numerous World War II and like Vietnam-based games, and that sort of represents a sort of historical distance in some ways. And in some ways, we've also seen introductory games that talk about Iraq and Afghanistan, specifically talking about the Call of Duty, Modern Warfare series, and that sort of representing the new ideas of war, but just really the Iraq war. What I wanted to talk about is that, or what I wanted to ask you all is that, is distance a requirement for games? Like I'm thinking about right now, the whole Russia-Ukraine conflict. Is that sort of too close to home? Do you feel like maybe this conflict will sort of spawn maybe video games of that event in the future, or maybe not?
Well, Josh and I in our club have had this discussion a lot over the years, and not for video games, but obviously for miniature wargaming. And the consensus seems to be there is no consensus. I know we've talked to gamers who refuse to game World War II, or refuse to game the Germans in World War II, or who won't game anything that they might have participated in themselves, like, from Gulf War all the way up through, even in our club, there's a variety of opinions on that. I generally, like, for example, I tend to not be as interested in as anything that's fairly modern. I'm a little uncomfortable with it. But there's another club member that will game anything. He has specifically said he doesn't need that distance personally. And I guarantee you right now, I haven't checked, but there is probably discussions on miniature wargaming forums where people are talking now about what miniatures you would use to wargame the current conflict in Ukraine. And I'm sure there are gamers who are either playing it or getting ready to, painting miniatures and actually gearing up to actually play it. And I know there are also wargamers who are like, nah, I just can't, I would not be able to play that. So that's been I know Josh and I have talked about that a lot.
Yeah, and I think a part of it comes down to personal experience. Like Keith said, if you're involved in Vietnam, you might not want to play Vietnam, especially if you were a grunt in Vietnam, or same with Iraq or Afghanistan. Depends on how intimate you were. You know, were you alive at that time? Maybe it might be uncomfortable for you. Or if you were involved in that engagement, but you were at a distance, you weren't maybe a frontline kind of infantryman or Marine, then it might be easier for you to game. And it just comes down to personal preference and what your experience is.
Yeah, one of the guys in our club was in Iraq in 2003 and was wounded, Purple Heart, Bronze Star, and he had no problem gaming Fallujah and things like that, things that he was involved in. So it's kind of interesting.
He finds it therapeutic because he likes to take the side of the insurgent. He actually games on the opposite side to kind of work through that stuff that he's been going through.
I think any gaming that would what I call our modern conflicts, you're going to have to deal with COBs, civilians on the battlefield, because the world's becoming more dense, and that doesn't matter if it's in a Central Asia, Middle East, or like you were talking about in a Ukraine, Russia thing. They're there. Now, does that mean all of them are all good, or all of them are all bad? But that's that gray line you have to walk when you're talking about warfare and conflict, is dealing with them, because you're either going to make a friend or make an enemy, or you're going to have a fence stander, and you're going to push them one way or another. So that's where, when it comes to those type of things, if you're trying to add realism, you have to address it.
Yeah, I think in terms of dealing with more recent conflicts, looking at the computer game space, the tendency, I think, is the closer you get to the present, the greater the tendency to fictionalize a conflict rather than use the direct historical exemplar. So you have something like the recent, Rebel Inc. escalation, which is, Iraq stroke Afghanistan. It's an insurgency simulator, but it isn't placed in either of those places. The other example that just jumps straight out is this War of Mine, which seems pretty heavily rooted in the experience of being a civilian during the breakup of Yugoslavia and the siege of Sarajevo, but never calls out that context. It's instead a fictionalized context that could be imported anywhere. I think you'll see that trend continue. In terms of gamifying Ukraine, this is already happening. There is sort of already an awareness in the computer strategy gaming space that the datedness of many of the platforms being used in Ukraine means that nearly all of them are included in Eugen Systems' war game Red Dragon, which simulated a late Cold War conflict gone hot, another, fictionalized conflict. And so you could get more or less the entire kit of the two sides and bash them into each other. I have to admit, I played that game years ago when it came out. I have not touched it since the war in Ukraine started, because that's a little fraught. Especially if you're, clearing cities with cluster munitions, a thing that in multiplayer matches one does in that game. It's also remarkable, just to tag here, there are no civilians in that game. All of the towns are magically depopulated of anyone that isn't a soldier. The streets are clear of civilian vehicles for you, and that's very common in the computer gaming space, especially in the strategy gaming space. All of the civilians are somehow magically removed from your military sandbox. And, that has, I think, implications in shaping how, in particular, the public imagines the machines of war functioning. Look at these, artillery tubes firing. Look at my impressive TOS-1 Buratinos incinerating a city block, and not having to think very much about who lived in that city block. I think that has an impact in the way that the games shape the public's understanding of conflict.
And I wanted to kind of shift to a question from the chat here, which I think is very important, as we talk about shaping the public's, imagination or thoughts about warfare, or even, as Bret mentioned, where civilians are in terms of combat. And as you all have seen with Russia, Ukraine, that civilians are forever present in some of the depictions there. But this question that Lloyd Kramer asked, I think, is very important in terms of culture. He asks, do war games give young people an unreal sort of view of war, like people had, when they sort of marched off to World War I? So talking about like propaganda, things of that nature. And just to kind of add on to Lloyd's question here, I remember seeing reports from a sociologist who did a research study about basically the quote unquote gaming generation, as pertaining to soldiers that joined in Iraq or Afghanistan, and how gaming was a huge part of I guess, that generation's upbringing, and makes the assumption that that's some of the reasons why those men, or men from that generation, joined the war. So just to kind of reiterate Lloyd's question here, do you feel like video games have that same, do you feel like they have that same function as propaganda during World War I, that sort of nationalistic propaganda, or do you feel like they have the potential to, parallel nationalist propaganda, or do you think it even exceeds maybe that type of propaganda that we saw from 1914 to 1918?
I would say no, because you just got to look at the numbers and how society has changed. If you look at the modern day military, it's not the same as the World War I or all the way up through Vietnam. We're an all volunteer force. And if you look at your recruiting numbers in the modern conflicts, I hate to say it, but because we're at an all volunteer force, even though those people joining might have gaming background or influence, they typically come from a military family where there's a military tradition. Because believe me, it's not inviting to the average person. Otherwise, our country wouldn't have to throw, I think the recruiting bonus now is $50,000 for somebody to join for 4 years. Good Lord, I wish I would have got that. But but also there comes that sense of nationalism or national pride that has diminished over time, and it correlates with history as our country has evolved and our military engagements aren't so, they can't be wrapped in the American flag, all red, white, and blue, like we can package them back in World War I because of information and technology.
If I can build on that, I mean, I think John is right about, do video games get butts into recruiting offices? I would tend to guess no. Where I think that they do influence this question is in how the civilian public thinks about this. Because in the end, right, we live in a democracy. The public gets to weigh in on strategic decisions every 2 to 4 years by choosing the decision makers. And I'm struck, if you go back and look at the computer games of the aughts and the 20 teens, by the degree to which many of them were selling a technological, sanitized vision of the global war on terror, where this was something that could be solved by American high technology, by precision munitions that didn't cause civilian casualties. And often there's a sort of revelry in gaming about the equipment and the technology that offers the seductive delusion, I think, to the public that our technology can solve what are fundamentally not technological problems that if we try military solutions will have to be solved, by soldiers on the ground in danger. And I think that does impact the public's decision making, gives them an inflated sense of the ability to cleanly solve problems with military force. Though I think to some degree, countervailed by events, failure in Afghanistan is sort of, for now, reminded everyone that, in fact, sometimes you can't fix problems that way.
Does anybody else want to add anything to that? All right.
I think there's always the potential there for games to be used that way in the future.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, didn't the U.S. Army have a video game at one point? I'm pretty sure the U.S. Army sponsored and ran a video game.
Yeah, that was a early 2000s. I forget what it was called.
America's Army, squad-based first-person shooter.
Right. Yeah. It was heralded as the ultra realistic, you join up, this is what you'll experience kind of thing. I never played it, but I don't know. But I also think I think that's a tough one for me. But my sense of it is that there's the American conception of war and the public understanding has changed a lot from World War II and World War I. Those two generations marched off to war with very little idea of what modern warfare was like, because modern warfare was in the act of being happening. It was occurring. And I think they came home, that generation after World War II especially, came home to a fundamentally different understanding of war. And then the generations since then have not only seen war presented in video games, but in movies and in the public space in a way that I don't think most Americans have a sanitized view of war. At least from those things, I think they have that view of war because since Vietnam, warfare has been invisible to us. We've been in Afghanistan for 20 years, and other than knowing veterans and occasional news reports, that the cost of that war has been invisible to us, largely. Not in the visceral kind of way that the World War II generation experienced it and came home with that. I don't know. That's a tough one. So maybe that's not a good answer, but my sense of it is that the public level of understanding of the cost of war is shifted more towards a realistic understanding. But I agree with your assessment that these video games and things can give us a sense that technology can solve these problems that can't be solved. So I agree with that, and that seems sort of contradictory with my point about the level of understanding. But I don't know. I don't know where I arrive on that.
Yeah, and I think this is these are good questions to really ask both of ourselves, but also as consumers even of video games. And this kind of leads to the last question I want to ask, which comes from actually an audience member, Kinsey Moritz. You know, they asked the question, you know, and this is more or less a pedagogical question. All of us mostly, you know, teach, you know, kids that are at the college level, but I don't know, maybe in you all's time, you've probably thought about, you know, this question as well, but this person asks, you know, how can we differentiate games for students of different education levels? So thinking of elementary school, college students, middle school, high school, because, you know, inevitably video games are here. Kids play them, they play them in abundance. And they also bring, you know, maybe some of those things that they've played through console, you know, computers. And if kids are even playing tabletops or board games, you know, they bring those experiences, those assumptions with them to class. So how can we kind of teach or differentiate games for students at various almost educational levels?
You know, I don't know about K through 12. That's not my level of expertise, so I can only speak to post-secondary. Because, you know, video games, tabletops, you know, entertainment, hobby, we talked about that. But to get them to have a more realistic and to connect with them, you know, I've said it and when I've talked with you, Matt, before, you know, you bring some of those people into your classroom, you know, let them tell their story and let the students interact with them. And, you know, and you have to preface it with everybody's experience is different, you know, depending on what job, where they were at, et cetera, et cetera. The other thing is to encourage supplemental reading to enhance, you know, what you're teaching them. And then get their feedback, you know, get a reflection. If if you say, hey, read this, get a reflection. Hey, what'd you get from that? And then incorporate that in a discussion, even if it's, you know, from a supplemental reading or having a classroom visitor, you know, incorporate that into a discussion afterwards, you know, to kind of see, okay, what'd you gain? You know, they can sift fact from fiction, draw a conclusion, and then you can kind of shake it out from there.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think also kind of again from the sort of post-secondary framework, I think, you know, as a historian, I think among historians, it's generally pretty well accepted that, you know, in order to be an effective teacher as a historian, you want to have some concept, some grounding on how the general popular culture imagines your topics as a sort of foundation to know where your students are coming from. And there, you know, to a degree, you want to be, for instance, film literate in how does your topic appear in film, because that is going to be part of how your students understand it before they come through the door. And I think that as educators, we need to start building a degree of literacy in games for the same reason, because this is an emerging, really it is an emerged medium that influences our students. We need to be critiquing it the way we would be critiquing film, analyzing it critically, and therefore prepared for the way that it's going to condition students before they enter our classroom, so that we're not sort of blindsided by the influences that these products can have on the way that on the history our students bring with them, as it were, the history in big quotes.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I can only speak also to higher ed as well. But one of the things that I try to emphasize to get them to look at the costs of things, and that, you know, one of the questions we did as an example of that in my World War II class, at the very end of the semester, after having covered everything, as kind of the last week we wrapped up, And one of the big discussions I tried to get going and that generated a lot of discussion and questions was who really won? Because there's an assumption with a lot of military topics that, well, there was a winner and a loser. But when you start to break down some of these conflicts, it's not always really very clear. Sometimes there are very clear losers. And one of the things that came up was, did the United States win World War II? And we seem to be one of the few winners. Did the Soviets win World War II? 20 million dead or more. Is that victory? Or from a Cold War perspective, was World War II a victory for the West when the Soviet Union took over, half of Europe? And it generated a lot of interest. And I think when you can get that discussion going and bring it into a lot of your discussions on conflict about who really won, was it really a victory? Who was the victor? Who was the loser? And you can generate a lot of, I think it makes warfare more meaningful and conflict more, gives it more context and meaning that beyond just, well, there was a battle and this side won, this side lost, and there was a treaty signed. It places things in context and gets people thinking, I think, more in human terms. But I found that to be very useful. I won't know how I would do it in a secondary setting because you obviously can't have some of those same discussions with elementary school kids. That would probably get a little interesting, but
yeah. So I mean that's pretty much all the time we have, but definitely to just add on a little bit, it would be interesting to kind of see this at a secondary level, but as all of you all have mentioned, and really the entire purpose of this event has been to create tools for instructors, educators, parents, people at various different levels that sort of interact with kids or other adults that are engaged in the gaming sphere, to provide good antidotes or just good tools of critique for video games. It's not to derail people from their hobbies or anything like that, but obviously to just pay attention to the different claims, as many of you have mentioned, that video games enforce or try to make, but also even the assumptions that people take from video games. So I really hope that this event has kind of helped people. For those audience members that did ask questions, I'm sorry I wasn't able to get to everyone's. These are all really fantastic questions. So definitely, if you want to ask any speaker any questions, in some of the individual interview descriptions on YouTube, you can find their information, whether that's Twitter, Little Wars TV. You all have an email, right? So if you all want to go and visit Little Wars TV's website, feel free to ask them questions as well. John, do you mind plugging your email if you want to welcome questions or anything like that?
Yeah, it's Regan, Regan, J, at Sandhills, spelt like it sounds, .edu.
All right, so definitely, if you want to ask John questions, or like I said, any of the speakers further questions about gamification, and anything related to actual warfare versus fantasy warfare, please feel free to email them and ask them questions. But lastly, I want to thank you all, for being a part of this panel. It's been a blast interviewing every single one of you all. It's been great hearing your experience as well. So I just wanted to thank you all as well. So thank you. And lastly, I am also hosting a second event that actually looks at war movies. That event will be May 23rd. The time is still to be determined, but there will be a flyer that will be circulating. It'll be the same format of a webinar. People can register, ask questions. In that event, I will be interviewing one of my colleagues in the UNC history department. His name is Cavender Sutton. And we will basically just be talking about war movies, and specifically Mel Gibson's We Were Soldiers, and also developing and asking some of the same questions about how war movies shape certain assumptions, how it handles historical content, and things of that nature. So if you're interested, please look out for that flyer. And thank you all once again for just being here and participating. Thank you.
Thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much.
Yep,
Appreciate it.
Thanks for setting this up. It's been great.
Absolutely. You'll have a good one.
You too. Take care.